In this lecture, we shall consider how W.K. Wimsatt and Cleanth Brooks, two of the most radical new critics, took the objective ontological theories of Richards and Ransom and carried them to an even higher level. We shall also consider the methods the new critics taught us for explicating poetry, and shall argue that new criticism is not elitist and private, but democratic and public. W.K. Wimsatt, a later, more radical new critic than Ransom, carries Ransom's critique of psychological and moral criticism even farther. You'll remember from our last lecture that Ransom wanted to do away with this psychological criticism that was only interested in emotions, or this moral criticism that always wanted some kind of moral or message as the most important thing. Well, W.K. Wimsatt, in two essays that he co-wrote with Monroe C. Beardsley, and the names of those two essays are The Intentional Fallacy and The Affective Fallacy. In those two essays, Wimsatt argues that neither authorial intention nor the reader's response is relevant to the analysis of a poem. First of all, let me mention that although these two essays were co-written, I'm just going to say Wimsatt. I really think he was the main person, so I will just say Wimsatt from now on. All right, what am I saying? The intentional fallacy, the affective fallacy. The intentional fallacy says that the intention of the author is really irrelevant to the poem or to the analysis of the poem. The affective fallacy says the effect that it has on the reader or the audience is also irrelevant. What am I saying? What I'm saying here is that now pragmatic theories that are interested in the audience and expressive theories that are interested in the poet are to be literally lopped off. We don't want to worry about those things anymore. Those are two things that take us away from the object, the poem. Now, critics who are guilty of the former fallacy, the authorial intention or the intentional fallacy, people guilty of that, take as their standard of analysis the psychological causes of the poem. In other words, they think that the real heart of the poem is its psychological causes, in other words, its author. Whereas those guilty of the affective fallacy judge a poem by its psychological effects, not its psychological causes in the mind of the author, but its psychological effects in the mind of the audience. That's what they mean by intentional and affective fallacy. Now, in either case, in either fallacy, Wimsatt argues, the critical enterprise drifts into relativism as external standards not inherent within the poem are arbitrarily applied. For them, the author's intention or the reader's response are external to the poem and irrelevant. They're only interested in internal things, what is occurring inside the poetic object, right? Objective theories, the poetic object. Now, when this happens, when we focus too much on the external, what happens is that the poem itself, as a self-contained artifact with its own aesthetic integrity and ontological existence, tends to disappear. We focus on the other things, we forget about the poem loses its integrity, it ceases to be a thing in itself, an end in itself. A nice way to put this is, after the biographical critic determines what the author was trying to do, and the psychological critic measures the quality of audience response, guess what? We are still left with a poetic object that must be analyzed. Wimsatt would say, like most of the new critics, you could tell me all of that external stuff, but you still haven't told me anything about the poem itself. This is new criticism at its most radical, at its most pure. Essentially, what Wimsatt is doing is rejecting both the romantic, expressive view of poetry as an extension of the poet, and the neoclassical, pragmatic view of poetry as something that either teaches and pleases, or that carries its reader away on a wave of sublimity. In other words, things that affect the audience. So they are moving away from a lot of what we've talked about earlier in this series. But they reject something else. They also reject, or he or they, any kind of epistemological criticism that would locate aesthetic beauty in our mental response to the poetic object. So they're also not interested in epistemology, not interested in what's going on in the mind of the reader. they're interested in the poem. You'll remember last class, or last lecture, I commented that even though they're Kantians, they are ontological Kantians. They're not epistemological. Now, they reject all of this. What do they do instead? Instead, they return to the classical, mimetic, ontological theories of Aristotle. And if the new critics are neo-Kantians, they're also in many ways neo-Aristotelians. But there's a slight difference. They go back to classical, mimetic, ontological, but from a radically word-centered, objective orientation. What am I saying? What I'm saying is that the poem is now to be cut off, not just from the poet and the reader, but even from the universe as well. Why? Because the poem is now its own universe. So it's not even exactly mimetic, because we're not interested in the relationship to poet or to audience, but we're not even really interested in the relationship to universe, because again, the poem is its own universe. Specifically, what the poem is a linguistic construct, an independent empire of words. They want to focus on the internal structure, on the words that make up the poem, and not worry about those three branches that we've been talking about in those theoretical perspectives. So we are at objective theories. All right. Although Wimsatt's single-minded focus, and again, when I say Wimsatt, I can also say the new critics in general, Wimsatt's single-minded focus on the poem may at first seem to us obscure, esoteric, and maybe even elitist. But I would argue that it is actually the opposite. Wimsatt argues in his essay, The Intentional and Effective Fallacy, in both of them, that once a poem is published, it no longer belongs to the poet or even to the literary critic. It belongs to the public. So this is not elitist. This is actually democratic. It's the opposite. He wants to say the poem belongs to the public, to the reader. It leaves the poet's hands. It even leaves the critic's hands and is given into the public. Now, there's a real irony here, because what we're saying here is Wimsatt is trying to take the focus off of external meanings and put it onto internal meanings. And I want to say that change, that shift, again, is not elitist, but it's the opposite. It's democratic. Why? Let's think about it. It is a poem's external meanings, the kind extracted from the personal letters of the poet, that are the most private and inaccessible. If you want to really find out the whole authorial intention, you've got to have access sometimes to fancy research libraries and letters and all that stuff, the kind of thing that the public is not always has access to. Today they have a little more access to it, especially with the internet and whatnot, but still, external meanings are often private. On the other hand, the poem's internal structure is public and open to all. We all have access to the internal structure, to the poem itself. Do you know what the new critics are really doing? They are mounting a sort of Protestant Reformation in criticism. What do I mean by that? What did the Protestant Reformation do? It said the individual can read the Bible and interpret it on his own. Doesn't need to be a priest, doesn't even need to go to seminary. Needs to know how to read, needs to be a good reader, but this is really very much a Protestant Reformation, if you want to think of it that way. Now, though most people are unfamiliar with the private musings of poets, again, we all live and breathe in the medium of words. If a poem is mostly words, well, we all know words because we live with words, so we can identify with that. Again, whereas external meanings are often removed or esoteric to the common man. If a poem, now, sometimes we might say, well, a poem might use an archaic word we don't understand. Well, if it does, all we need to do is consult our handy-dandy Oxford English Dictionary, the OED. And I'll tell you, new critics love the OED. Indeed, the only kind of external research that Wimsatt allows is a study of the special connotations that certain words held for certain poets. In other words, they don't want to get into biographical detail, but if a poet like Blake or Yeats, or in the case of Joyce in his prose, has like a special vocabulary of their own, as some poets, especially modern poets do, that's okay. Then you can get out your OED, then you can get out journals if you can find them, because words are what the poem is made out of. So that kind of external research is allowed. Again, such connotations, word connotations, are directly relevant to the internal structure of the poem, and therefore they do not fall under the aegis of the intentional fallacy. It's not an intentional fallacy anymore because those words are part of the poem, and so it's legitimate. And in fact, the new critics have really been helpful because a lot of the books they've published are books that explain to us the meanings of words or the meanings of esoteric words, especially in critics like, or rather poets like William Blake. So again, we keep our focus on the words. All right, let us now shift to Cleanth Brooks. Cleanth Brooks, who is certainly the best known and most radical of the new critics, developed even further the ontological, objective, linguistic focus of Wimsatt. And I should mention that Cleanth Brooks only passed away about 5 years ago. Very long life, continued to work right to the end, even though he was attacked on all sides in the last several years of his life. Now, in a famous essay called The Heresy of Paraphrase, Cleanth Brooks is so radical in his new criticism that he even took John Crowe Ransom, who was his teacher, to task for suggesting that a poem contains a distinct paraphrasable core. By the way, most of these new critics are from Louisiana State University, LSU. They're very linked to that school, by the way. Anyway, oddly enough, they were helped by the, quote, tyrant Huey Long as much as Horace was helped by the tyrant Caesar Augustus. It's interesting how tyrants sometimes help literature and criticism. Anyway, why did he attack the idea of the paraphrasable core that we looked at in the previous lecture? Because Brooks argues that there is no plot summary, no separate logical statement that can be extracted from a poem and viewed apart from its texture. He says, no, you can't extract this paraphrasable core and look at it as Ransom suggests. Why can't you do that? Because for Brooks, the poem is its union of structure and texture, of paraphrasable core and lively local details, to use the vocabulary of the previous lecture. That's what it is. Or really what it is the tension that exists between the two, the structure and the texture. A poem does not have a simple reductive meaning. You cannot remove the core from the details. That would be like trying to extract my soul from my body. If you do that, I die. I cease to be what I am as a human being. I cease to be ontologically what I am. You cannot remove the two. That, again, is what the ontological essence of the poem is. Structure and texture completely interwoven. In fact, Brooks is so emphatic about this that he often uses the word structure in a higher sense than Ransom to refer to a poem's total pattern, to its full complex of meaning. This often confuses people. Ransom uses structure just to mean the paraphrasable core. Brooks uses structure to mean structure plus texture. So he means a higher structure, the whole poem as a unit. That sometimes confuses people. Brooks gives us a wonderful definition of the poem. He calls a poem a pattern of resolved stresses. According to Brooks, within the microcosm of the poem, opposing forces are balanced and harmonized. And again, a poem is the balance or harmonization of all those different pressures moving in different ways, structure and texture moving in different ways. However, an important distinction, this balancing is not a negative or reductive one which eliminates or solves all the tension. Rather, it is a positive unity that resolves each element of the poem into a fuller symphony, a richer counterpoint. In other words, the opposing forces do not cancel themselves out. They stay, they don't destroy each other, but it's a higher resolution. It's like a symphony. Right? All the different strands and themes and leitmotifs that are hitting each other, they don't cancel each other out. They move to a higher unity. Or, to use an analogy I've used several times now, it's like a marriage. Marriage is two into one flesh, but that doesn't mean husband and wife lose their individual personality. They remain themselves with all their idiosyncrasies, but those idiosyncrasies should work together to a higher whole, to the marriage, to the two into one. So again, a poem is something mystical in the way marriage is mystical, or a good symphony is really mystical in a way. A poem, Brooks says, is not a static or logical arrangement of concrete details around a universal truth, which is what what Ransom suggested. It is not that. Rather, it is a dynamic, dramatic process in which each detail, each truth, is given the freedom to exert its own unique pressure. A poem is dynamic. It's like a drama where everybody has a different voice that collides in a wonderful pattern. That's what a poem is. Poems are dramatic. Even poems that are lyric are dramatic. And like Ransom's idea of the poem as a democracy, he does agree with Ransom in that sense, that every different voice exerts its own pressure. All right. For Brooks and Wimsatt, therefore, the job of the true critic is a little different. The job of the true critic, to a new critic, is to explicate poems, to unpack their internal tensions and reveal their inner structure. And this is the part most of you are going to recognize from new criticism, because new criticism, I would argue, is the most pedagogical, most pragmatic theory that we'll probably do in this entire series. It is practical and can be brought into the classroom immediately and effectively. And this is the side we think of, the close reading, or what they call explication, where they open up a poem and interpret it for us. I would suggest that almost everybody listening to my lecture, you probably learned the new critical way of reading poetry. Whether you knew it or not, that's the way you learn. By the way, in the movie Dead Poets Society, there's an example of making fun of new criticism, a very reductive view of new criticism as mathematical and whatnot. That was kind of nasty. I love that movie, but that was kind of a straw man new critic they were making fun of in that movie. Anyway, though the critic may use a poem's paraphrasable core as a scaffold, Brooks says, he must never let it take the place of his analysis. Sorry, what he's saying is he agrees that when you first get into a poem, you might want to use the paraphrasable core just as a way to begin, to get you in. But we must not look at that core as a structure or a frame. Look at it as a scaffold, because you build a scaffold to help you build the house, but once the house is built, you break the scaffold and throw it away. That's the same thing. We might use the paraphrasable core to get ourselves in, but once we're in, we throw it away and we stick to the poem itself, structure plus texture together. Indeed, one of the greatest legacies of new criticism is the methods they taught us for moving past narrative into the heart of the poem. They taught us how to move past plot summary and get there. And as a teacher of undergrads, the hardest thing to get students to do is to move past plot summary. You ask them to write an essay about Romeo and Juliet, all they want to do is tell you what happened, plot summary. And you have to kill them to get them to dig deeper, because that's hard to do. It calls for critical thinking, which is a very important skill. And they resist it, but we've got to go in. Because the key to a new critical explication of a poem, or a close reading, is the assumption that the greatest poems do not present their ideas directly, but through a complex deflection of meaning. You can't just simplify it and say, this is what King Lear means. There's all these ironies that are bouncing against each other. And so it calls for a very subtle critique that shows how the whole poem or the whole play works together in that pattern of resolved stresses. This is a difficult thing to do. What I'm saying, again, is that new critics do not try to break the code of a poem or simplify it into a moral. Rather, they seek to uncover its essential ironies, paradoxes, and ambiguities. And those are words that new critics love. Irony, paradox, ambiguity. They use it again and again because that's the tension they're talking about. Now, an important distinction. When they say irony, they're not trying to say that poetry is insincere or wishy-washy. That's not what they mean. On the contrary, irony is the principal medium through which poetry speaks. Ontologically speaking, a poem is an ironic structure. That's what a poem is, again, ontologically speaking. That's what its essence is. To say it's ironic doesn't mean it's wishy-washy, it doesn't know what it's talking about. It means that that's how meaning emerges out of a poem, through tension and deflection of meaning and paradox and ambiguity. Indeed, building on I.A. Richards now, Brooks contrasts the ironic structure of poetry with the clear, unambiguous statements of positivistic science. What sets poetry apart from science is that poetry is ironic in its structure, whereas science is. If science was ironic, we'd really be confused. So this is the difference, again, between science and poetry. They're all interested in the distinction between the two. And again, they would say that that ironic structure is often a higher kind of truth. Think about it. All right, the teachings of Jesus, and whatever else Jesus was, he was a great poet. If you think about it, everything Jesus said was expressed in paradoxes, wasn't it? Those who would gain their life must lose it. The first will be last. If you want to be free, you've got to become a slave. This kind of, everything Jesus said is in paradox. It's very, very poetical. It's very ironic. But certainly Jesus wasn't being insincere or wishy-washy. He was getting at a higher kind of truth that could only be expressed in a paradox or an irony or an ambiguity. Now, in a later essay, called Irony as a Principle of Structure, Brooks uses a wonderful image of an arch as a metaphor for how poems both work and mean. Many of you know that arches can be constructed without cement because the opposing forces of an arch are actually what keep it together. It's a paradox. The arch pushes against itself and to destroy itself, but the very tension is what gives the arch its stability. Isn't that a paradox? That's how a poem works. The very tension of the poem is what holds it together. That's mysterious, almost spiritual. Indeed, the best close readings, and I love to read these, reveal how, within the ironic synthesis of the poem, even ugly or discordant elements can be so brought into equilibrium as to form an eternal work of aesthetic beauty and truth. In other words, you can have an ugly element in a poem, but if it's balanced right in terms of the irony, the overall effect will be beauty and harmony. This is true of symphonies by, say, Tchaikovsky. They may have some atonal element, but within the whole, it's beauty and harmony. All right, finally, in the last 9 minutes here, I want to mount a defense of new criticism. They are attacked so much these days that I think they need to be defended. Now, what are they attacked for? New critics are often accused today of being elitist, judgmental, and narrow-minded, partly because they're Southern aristocrats in some ways. Okay? They are attacked. Now, what I want to do is first give you the reasons why they're blamed or accused of these things, and then defend them. First of all, the reason why they're called elitist, judgmental, and narrow-minded. First of all, their critics say, new critics are strongly canonical. They believe that there exists a body of works that are inherently superior and possess essential, timeless value. How small-minded, how narrow-minded, how politically incorrect of them. And not only that, but the new critics assess the value of these works of the canon on the basis of aesthetic standards that, they claim, transcend both historical and cultural boundaries. Kind of Kant's subjective universality. Who are they to say that their criteria is a universal criteria? That their criteria is somehow objective and beyond time and space and political factors and whatnot? Another reason is new critics employ words like heresy and fallacy, heresy of paraphrase, intentional fallacy, to stigmatize those who would move outside the poem or deny their conception of poetry. And it is true, interestingly, they do use some religious language sometimes, but they're attacked for that. Finally, they insist, the new critics, that all critics learn their methods and vocabulary. How elitist that they expect everybody to learn their vocabulary and use it. Now, there is another attack. Oftentimes, new critics are attacked on philosophical and aesthetic grounds, but we'll explore those attacks in our last unit. But I want to just focus on the ones I talked about. All right, let me give my defense. First of all, let me admit that in one sense, the new critics are unfair, and that is that they tend to be unfair to overly emotional poets like Shelley. Sometimes they're a little unfair. They do love Keats. They prefer Keats to Shelley because of negative capability, and he's more refined somehow to a new critic. And they put down Shelley and they lift up what are called the metaphysical poets for being more intellectual. However, I would argue that other than that, new criticism has not only not been elitist, but it has been anti-elitist. Here's my defense. First of all, as to the canon, I would argue that nearly all the works of the canon had long been accepted as superior. The new critics, all they did was give us a method and vocabulary to help reveal why these works were felt to be worthy of preservation and study. Everybody knew what was in the canon. They just told us. Let me get back on my soapbox again. One thing that drives me crazy is when church people constantly remind you that the church gave us the Bible. That is true that the church put together the canon and fashioned it. But by the time they did it, almost everybody knew what belonged in there. Now, there are certain, small letters that are argued about, but people knew, we have a sense of what is right and what is wrong. Believe me, if you ever read the Gnostic Gospels of Thomas and Philip, you could tell me they don't belong in the Bible. They're so different and so strange. They're a meditation, a Gnostic meditation on Scripture. They have very little to do with the historical Jesus. So what I'm saying about the Bible, I would say about the canon. People knew what was canonical, even before Arnold and Eliot try to set it in stone, or the new critics. All right, another defense. The new critics are not elitist. The new critics wrested control of theory away from an academic coterie of researchers with access to special collections and studies, and put it in the hands of anyone with a critical mind, an eye for irony, and an OED. They're the ones that took poetry out of the ivory tower and gave it to us. There's that Protestant Reformation again. Take it out of the church, and not completely, but take it out of there and give it to us so that we can read it and we can understand it. Above all, the new critics, unlike postmodern theory that is so obscure and jargon-rich that only a small body of PhDs can understand and apply it, new criticism can be quickly taught, learned, and put into practice by graduates, undergraduates, and even advanced high schoolers. It is true, modern and postmodern theory, a lot of PhDs don't understand it. They may not admit it, but a lot of them don't understand it. It's so jargon-rich and difficult. New criticism is just wonderful. All you have to do is learn a little bit of vocabulary, a few things, and you go. As long as you got that critical mind. And it can be taught. And it can be taught to high schoolers. Good high schoolers, and like a gifted and talented program, can write you excellent new critical analysis of a poem. All right? The true goal of new criticism, which is totally anti-elitist, is through hands-on training in the art of explication to empower and free students to interpret on their own. That's what they're doing. They are not keeping the power to themselves. They are saying, let me teach you these methods, and then you can do it on your own. As I always tell my students, my job is to make myself obsolete, to teach you so well and give you so many critical tools that you can do it on your own without me. And that's what I think a good pastor should do, teach his congregation how to read the Bible so they can do it on their own. So again, a new critic is like that. All right. Indeed, this is funny. Here's an irony. The last several generations of English majors, including the czars of postmodernism, heck, they cut their teeth on new critical methods. The new critics taught them how to read poetry. And so I'm going to argue there's another anxiety of influence here. The postmodern theorists are trying to kick off their Oedipal fathers. You know, they're trying to knock them off and have their own space. You know, in the same way that you see people attacking now the World War II veterans and whatnot and saying, oh, you know, that's old stuff. We don't need them. They were closed-minded. It's a fighting or a knocking off of the father. Finally, the new critics not only carried democratic ideals into the ivory tower of critical theory. You know what else they did? They brought democratic ideals into the elite world of creativity by all but inventing the concept of creative writing classes for aspiring writers. If any of you listening to me ever took a creative writing course at a community college, you can really thank the new critics for that. They really got that idea started. What's more elitist than this idea of, I'm a poet and I'm separate? They said, no, we can now. That doesn't mean everybody that goes to a community college is going to be a great poet, but that's okay. They can learn to write poetry and express themselves and do it as well as they can. Learn a little bit of irony themselves. That's a very new critical thing. Ironically, it is postmodernism with its multicultural, relativistic agenda that has cut the academy off from the public at large. Back in the days of the new critics, the Academy was very involved in the public life. Things like the New Yorker and the Atlantic Monthly, there were a lot more magazines and journals like that, quote, regular people could read. Nowadays, you try to read an English journal. It doesn't make any sense. Again, a lot of PhDs don't understand the articles that are written in the big English journals nowadays. It's crazy. So, again, this really bothers me because, again, the new critics are not elite. They're democratic. They're public. It's modernism and postmodernism that has cut people off from the academy. It is the vision of new criticism that has made poetry available to us all. And you want to know a great irony? I would argue that if it wasn't for the new critics, there would be no teaching company. Because finally, at the heart of the teaching company is the desire to empower its students and clients to learn and then to be able to continue on its own. So really, the whole concept of the teaching company is new critical because it says, let's get this stuff out into the public. Let's take it out of the academy and out of the research libraries and into the world. Again, new critics are a good example of modernism. One of the things that drives me crazy is if you go to a modern art gallery with a postmodernist and you say, what's so great about this modern art? They'll never tell you. They'll always say, oh, you couldn't understand. It's above you. No new critic would ever say that. They'd sit down and show you the irony or the paradox or the ambiguity. They would explain it to you. They wouldn't sit there and say, you can't understand, you're a peon. So, again, I'm getting passionate here, but it's because the new critics are so often attacked, and I really think unfairly. All right, in our next lecture, we will conclude this unit by looking at the archetypal theories of Northrop Frye.